Hello everyone. I've been posting a couple of videos on the BMPCC subreddit as well as the Filmmakers subreddit and on various other places on the internet. They were just little videos that I did with my new Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, which is a very nice little camera. But a lot of people have a lot of questions about it. It's certainly an odd camera, seeing as it's cheap and it's small, but it is able to pack a lot of image quality into that small little camera. So many people have a lot of questions about, is it good for an amateur filmmaker, or if I would recommend a DSLR. And so anyways, on one of my videos, I showed a little comparison between my raw footage and then with the grade applied through DaVinci and then a fine tuning in Final Cut X. And someone recommended this to me that I do a little tutorial. And so I want to first of all apologize for any weird audio, gross audio, or kind of anything bad really. This is my first video tutorial, and I kind of want to do this more often, so any feedback or help would be great. I'm just recording this on my built-in microphone on my computer, but I can certainly whip up something a little better down the line. So please excuse the hairiness of this recording, and I guess we should just jump in. So I figured just do one shot just to keep it simple. The shot I picked is this one. This is the raw footage. This is straight from camera. The footage here is on the setting, the film dynamic range setting. For any of you who don't know, there are two settings on the camera. There's a video mode and a film mode. And video mode is kind of like what your DSLR would produce, more or less. It's sort of like a quick and dirty way of just getting your video and being able to publish it right away. There's not much grading that you are required to do, unlike the film setting, like you can see here, which obviously requires a lot of grading, because it's very flat and bland looking straight out of the camera. So I would absolutely recommend always shooting in film mode. I mean, I'm shooting these videos just literally on the go. This video I shot was just a trip that my girlfriend and I had taken to a corn maze, and I just so happened to decide to bring along my camera, and so I was not like trying to make this a perfect, example, perfect specimen of cinematography, and many of these shots are literally, I see something kind of cool, so I just kind of dial in a rough exposure and go with it. So, the film mode, yes, you need a lot of grading in post, but it's actually very easy, and I'll show you why in a second. But first of all, this shot, one of the reasons why I took this shot, or I'm using this shot for the tutorial, is that I have multiple versions of it, essentially. This was a shot that I did a couple different times with a couple different exposures. So as you can see here, this is a little bit perhaps, I think it was a little overexposed from what my auto iris was telling me. This one I think is the auto iris, and then the one that I chose is a little bit underexposed. I'll show you why I like to do the underexposed ones in a second. And then this one is very underexposed. And this one ended up being pretty grainy, so I decided not to use it. But the one right above it was kind of like, it's a little bit grainy too, but it's a lot closer to what I want. What I'm aiming for is underexposing it just a little bit, and the reason why I do that is not necessarily to preserve highlights, but to put the contrast range of the scene into a certain place, because when you shoot with the BMPCC and you're shooting it or really any digital camera, the camera has what's called a linear response, and even something like an Alexa that has a log setting is not actually capturing it kind of in a log manner. It's still a linear response. And I love film. I love the look of film, and I shoot on 35mm all the time, motion picture. So I'm kind of obsessed with that, the logarithmic look of film, which is essentially higher contrast in the shadows and lower contrast in the highlights. Because what's happening with film is it exposure from stop to stop is more what our eyes see. It's very hard to explain, but basically the areas of underexposure in a shot, if you're shooting on 35, you will have a sharper increase, a faster increase in exposure, because the curve, the response curve is literally going from, kind of way down and then slowly increasing in its slope. So it's kind of like a sort of parabolic curve, sort of. With linear response, it's just straight. It's boop, boop. And so I like to try to emulate the look of a logarithmic response, because that's, in my mind, kind of the gold standard of imaging, especially because that's how our eyes see. So anyways, enough talk. I'm going to take this shot and load it into DaVinci. This is DaVinci Resolve Lite, which is a free version, and so if you have a BMPCC, I would absolutely say to get this version. As far as I know, there's only a couple features that they don't have in the Lite version, which is, I think, just 4K support and something else. I'm not really sure, but it's pretty full-featured. So what we're going to do is I have my footage on my external drive. Here you can see I misspelled the word corn. And I have not gotten around to changing that because I think it's kind of funny. So that's probably going to stay. I mean, I really don't care. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this shot, which is the one that I chose, the one that's underexposed but not quite too underexposed. I'm just going to double click it, and that loads it into the media pool. And from there we can switch to the color panel, I suppose. And here you get all sorts of different controls. I'm a pretty newbie color grader, so I really don't use much of this stuff. Here are your color wheels, and there are all sorts of crazy controls in here. But the most important one is this one, the curves. This one, the luminance versus saturation, which is something that I literally just found, and this panel with the normal saturation control. So first thing you want to do after you get footage in, sorry about that, when you get footage into the grader is to boost the saturation. But just for funsies, I'm gonna really quickly take this, which is kind of like, or maybe the other one. I figure maybe do a side by side with one that's quote unquote correctly exposed, and then my kind of my underexposure. So yeah, the first thing you want to do is take the saturation all the way up to 100. That is the limit that this program has. I don't really know why, because it's actually not enough to correctly to correctly what's the word? Take the raw, or not the raw, the film dynamic range mode from the camera and put that back into normal. It looks pretty good. This shot looks pretty good for that, but there are some shots that I've done which, when you put it up to saturation, you're kind of like, well, it doesn't look any different. So yeah, take the saturation up to 100. I'll go ahead and do that for this one too, just to have like a starting point. So you can already see kind of the underexposure and then regular exposure here. So working on the underexposure one first, because that's going to be the one that has a little bit more tweaking. We want to then go into the curves panel, and this is where you essentially can change the gamma to however you want. I'm not going to do anything in the red, green, or blue, but you'll see they're actually ganged together, so as I change to the luminance, it will change everything. The first thing that I like to do is I like to drag from the middle out, just create a little hump, and what I'm doing here is I'm essentially eyeballing exposure. So I'm taking kind of like the midpoint of the luminance curve and pushing it out to boost the exposure from the underexposed back to basically normal. And I like to overshoot it just a tiny bit, and I'll show you why in a second. The next thing that I do is down in the shadows, you want to create a bit of a foot here on the curve, and what that's doing is it's taking the shadows and bringing them down a little bit more. And so therefore the shadows that are all the way down at the bottom past the little node here will have a lower contrast, but going from the kind of mid or low shadows all the way up to kind of the center of the gamma will have a higher contrast because of this higher slope, or steeper slope here, than what a linear curve will have. And the reason why I'm doing that is because, again, with a logarithmic response, you have a sharper increase, higher contrast, basically, in anything that's below kind of the midpoint, and then a lower contrast, which you can already see is up here, with it being more shallow in the highlights. And then what I like to do is, especially with these clouds in the background, you can see are pretty gray and boring, so I like to take another, throw down a little node and increase that until they look kind of bright. And the reason why I'm doing that is again to create more of a little bit more of a gentle roll off into the highlights, and again this kind of lower contrast look at the top. And so I'm just going to adjust this a little bit more to kind of adjust that overall gamma adjustment. So basically what you have here is, slow, or a lower slope going into a higher or a steeper slope, sorry, and then going into what's kind of a lower slope that gradually tails off into on a nice shoulder into the highlights. This will create a nice roll off, and so that's the reason why I underexpose that, is to bring that exposure up, which allows me to kind of play with the gamma curve to make it look a little more logarithmic. And then the last thing is to switch over to this loom versus sat through this drop down here. What this does is it's essentially a graph of luminance versus saturation. What I'll do is I'll take this end and just push it all the way to the top, and then somewhere down here I'll just kind of bring that down a little bit to balance it out. So now the midtones are being a little bit more saturated. Again, I find DaVinci to be a little bit lacking in terms of that overall saturation control at the beginning there. And another thing with film with 35mm is because it's a negative, then when you have an area of overexposure, it's actually denser on the negative, so it looks blacker. And the thing with that is that the dyes are denser in those areas, so you actually get what is basically more of a vivid saturation in the highlights when you're working with film, and that's very critical for kind of like the film look of footage. So that's what I've done with this graph, is I've had the saturation start off kind of at the normal, what DaVinci calls normal or so, and then slowly increase just to give it a little bit more of a boost, and then increase all the way up to the highlights, which will put a little bit more life into these highlights. So now I'm done with this shot, and I'm going to go ahead and move over to this one just as kind of a comparison. So to show kind of like what I like to do in this shot, and then what one might do under other circumstances. So I've already increased the saturation to 100, so that's good. Switching over to the curves, I want to go back to this custom panel, which gives me the luminance curves. And it's obviously, you know, much lower contrast. So what we want to do is we want to take the blacks and give it a foot, and the highlights give it a shoulder. And so this increases contrast while making a roll off in the highlights and shadows and such. And I'll increase exposure a little bit here, just a tiny bit. And but in doing this, you know, you get essentially what is you know, more or less the same. Sorry, I'm tweaking this a little bit more. More or less the same, you know, contrast as this other one. Actually, before I go into that, I'll just do this saturation control again. So again, big boost in the highlights, and then just a little tail off into the shadows. So comparing this to what I've done here, you can kind of see that the highlights in this clip, the first clip, are a lot more low contrast than in this clip. And you can especially see that kind of in the sky. The sky is a little bit darker in the second one. The reason why I like doing it this way, this first way, is because it gives it um, in my opinion, a little bit more of a pleasing sort of higher quality contrast look to it. It still looks relatively high contrast, but you know, it is a very high contrast scene, and so you can still see a fair amount of detail everywhere, and that's really important. And so, anyways, there, you know, that's a good comparison right there. It's very close. Obviously, the exposure is pretty similar, anyways. Um, but to me, this one is a lot more pleasing, and so I generally stick with that, you know, rule of slight underexposure. Um, so I'll take these two then and take them over to the next step, which is delivery. And basically what this panel does is it just renders your footage. And if you don't do anything in the timeline down here, it's going to render all of your clips, as long as, I believe, this option is selected, the render timeline as individual source clips. That's important because if you accidentally right-click on one of these things and say render this clip, it will just specify that one clip to be rendered, and I haven't figured out a way to reverse that. So I've gotten stuck before where I have a ton of clips, but I can't render them all at the same time because I've decided to just render one or something like that. It's a pain in the butt. So as it means you have to go and click on every single one of them and click render this clip and then add the job. So here, you know, you have your general render controls. Codec, sorry, I'm going to keep as ProRes HQ, and at the normal resolution. I'm going to bump this down, the frame rate down to 23. The reason why is because I shot this stuff at 23, so I don't want it to drift or anything like that. It would be very minimal, but I just want to be, you know, as close as possible. And then most of this other stuff, most of this other stuff is you don't have to deal with, but this render job too is very important. So you know, you click browse and you essentially choose where it's going to go. I'm just going to use this BMPCC folder. The problem with what was I saying? Yeah, I don't know. So anyways, I'm just gonna go ahead and add the job to my queue. It's gonna prompt me about the fact that the folder already exists, so it's concerned that it's gonna overwrite clips in that folder. This is important, so make sure that you're saving these clips to a new folder, because I've had it erase my original camera stuff before. And so be careful about that. So I'll just hit continue here. I remember what I was going to say. DaVinci, for some reason, has a very weird thing about file management. So, for example, if I were to create a folder in here, it would not show up in DaVinci until I quit and reloaded DaVinci. So keep that in mind. Create your folders first, or be prepared to quit. I don't know if there's a way of refreshing that, but normally programs are able to know when things change. But for some reason, DaVinci hasn't done that for me. So keep that in mind. So once I've added the job, I hit render, and it will go through both of the shots, and they're pretty fast, or they're pretty short. So this will be pretty fast. So looks like that's done. So I think it only rendered one clip. So I will have to tell it to render that other one. I don't know why it does that sometimes. But anyways, right click, click on render this clip. and somehow it thought I only wanted the first one, so I'm gonna just add the job again, and it's a different file, so it shouldn't overwrite what I just rendered. And so both of them are rendered now. You can see them here. This is the first shot. You can see the highlights still look a little dull, so I might want to tweak it. It's very hard to tweak in DaVinci because the screen is so small. And again, I mean, I'm new to this stuff, so I really don't know if there's a good way of kind of reorganizing the screen. I guess it's probably in here somewhere, but ooh, enhanced viewer. There you go. So I have learned something. So anyways, but I found that if anyone owns this program, it's a terrible program, but Final Cut Pro X, yeah, I mean, it just doesn't work like an editor, in my opinion, but it does get the job done, and it has a nice color correction, nice color correction settings. So we're gonna go ahead and import these files. Gonna do both of these. It's going into an event already, it looks like, but I don't want to do any of this optimized media or proxy media stuff or color balance or any of this junk. I mean, I keep this one selected because who cares, but so we'll just go ahead and import those. Here are the clips again. Again, this is clip 2. I don't know why it's doing that. Clip 2, and then this is clip 1. And so I'm going to drag both of these in, and you just click on the clip here, and you bring it's already open, but brings up this panel, and it says correction 1. This is under the color tab, and this will give you all the correction stuff. I found that doing rolling shutter repair and stabilization can be nice, but it depends. I did not do this at all in for this footage, but I have done it in the past. Usually if I do stabilization, I will like just barely give it anything because I don't want it to take away much resolution. But anyways, I'm not going to do that because it's already, you know, who cares. So under correction 1, we have the color, saturation, and exposure tabs. I like to do just a little bit of fine-tuning in here, like, you know, for exposure, maybe I'll just take the highlights up just a tiny bit to kind of give it a little bit, you know, more of a, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but it gives the highlights a little bit less of a dull look, especially in the clouds there. And then I always usually drop the shadows down a little bit because typically DaVinci doesn't show what it exports. It's very odd. I can kind of show you that here, but if I go to, no, it's the stupid enhanced viewer, huh? Yeah, so here's the first shot. If I go to this first shot and going back to FCPX, this is the ungraded one, the one that I did not tweak. This is the tweaked one, and this one up here is the one that I, oops, sorry. This one here is the one that I did not tweak yet. So if we switch between these two, you can see a difference. The blacks are certainly thinner. The whites are probably a little lighter. Generally, it just looks a little lighter than what DaVinci tells you. So, you know, it does lie a little bit. So this is why I'm doing some of this correction here, because I found that Final Cut X does a really good job when it exports of keeping all of that, the gamma and saturation, all that really really consistent. So again, I've done just a little bit of tweaking here. You know, I like to have some shadows. This is, you know, a high contrast scene kind of, but these shadows are not necessarily that dark. You know, or they weren't that dark in real life. So I'm not going to play with that too much. So for any of you who don't know, this is the shadow. All of these things have like different controls for either shadow, midtones, or highlights, and then there's an overall correction. So here I'm just taking the shadows down a little bit and giving it a little bit more, bringing the highlights up a little bit more. I want to be really careful because I don't want to clip those highlights, but if it just kind of kisses white, then that's okay. Until I found that Loom versus Sat graph, I had been taking this and bumping the saturation quite a ways up. Obviously, it looks like way too much now, but I had previously been doing that in Final Cut instead of in DaVinci. So I'm just going to leave that as it is because I think that for the saturation, it looks pretty darn good. You know, maybe just a tad, but it looks pretty good. So I'm glad I found that because I had been just like every single shot just like pumping that up like crazy because DaVinci was not giving me enough saturation. So and then the final thing is slightly subjective, but I've noticed that the camera is ever so slightly green, and it's noticeable in the sky, especially. There are a couple shots that I took that are very noticeable, that are mostly sky, and so what I do is in this color palette here, the global control is by default just kind of in this green area, so it's kind of at a perfect position for us to do this adjustment. I usually just take this down by 1 point, so I just type in -1 and hit enter. And what that does is it just adds a tiny bit of magenta to the image. And you know, comparing it, here it is without the magenta and the oops, gotta hate Final Cut X. Here it is without the magenta and basically straight from DaVinci, and then here it is with the magenta in Final Cut X. You know, I definitely notice a little bit of a green shift. I have not been able to figure out if it's maybe on my end, like a lens or a filter. I do use, you know, polarization and an ND filter usually when I'm shooting outside, because I usually shoot just at the native ISO, which is 800, in order to preserve as much latitude as possible. But if you notice this, I would certainly recommend just giving it a tiny dose of magenta. It just needs a little. Some of my previous videos, I definitely overdid it, but and it definitely changes the more you underexpose. The more the shot is underexposed, the more green it will look. This is pretty typical of digital cameras in general, in my opinion. The shadows tend to look green, and so who knows? But that's what I do. You know, take it or leave it, I suppose. And then and then we have this other shot to tweak. So I'm just gonna, again, you know, using this or doing the second shot, I'm gonna knock it down by -1 globally, which, you know, it's in the green column, so it does magenta. If it's elsewhere, don't do it because it's gonna start doing weird things to your image. Saturation, you know, maybe a tad of highlight saturation, tad more, and then again knocking those shadows down and maybe highlights up a little bit. So, you know, again, here's my version, my slightly underexposed. I I don't think it even was by a full stop, but it was somewhere around a little less than a stop, underexposed, and then this is kind of straight from the camera, so to speak. You know, the straight from the camera one is, in my opinion, too video-y. I like kind of the more natural, or the slower roll off into the shadows. I like my highlights. I like my highlights to look bright. I don't like them to look white. And that's one of the reasons why I do the exposure in the highlights, is to give them a little bit more of a vivid feeling versus just a kind of a plain white feeling. But it is up to you. You know, it's also up to you to decide which one of these looks better. And this one is perhaps still a little dark, but I'm not going to worry about that now, since it's just a rough tutorial. And then, you know, the final thing is, once you get all your stuff in, obviously, if you've used this program, you'd know, you click on the sharing, you press export media, and you can export it to however you want. You know, if you're going to web, H.264 is great, and the compressor going from Final Cut X is pretty darn good for H.264, so that's what I would recommend. But if you're going to want to, you know, do other things with it, like maybe if you're doing Blu-ray or something like that, definitely stick with ProRes for now, and then use a different encoder to encode a really high-quality H.264. You know, Final Cut X does a really good job at doing it, but if you're going to Blu-ray, you're going to want something like 25 megabits per second, or is it megabytes per second? I'm not sure when we're talking about that kind of thing, but you know, 25 is you know, sort of Blu-ray quality about, and so definitely don't use Final Cut X's export, because it's not going to give you that high of quality. Instead, export as ProRes. So that's it, I suppose, for now. I hope to do more of these. So again, you know, if you have any ideas, just tell me, and I will. Sorry, not just ideas, but just feedback in general. You know, what I could maybe do better. What stuff needs more explanation. You know, in general, I am kind of assuming that you guys know, you know, a little bit more than just a total newbie to the computer. I don't have to be like, this is the mouse, you point it at things, and then you click, and it will activate that thing. Because, you know, I know filmmakers in general are very computer savvy, so at least the ones I know. So anyways, just keep shooting, I suppose. Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. It's a very nice camera. I'll see you next time.